we're getting science now from human medicine that shows that a small worm burden can actually be beneficial to horses. So just like in humans, when we eradicate all bacteria, pathogens, viruses, and everything else, we get autoimmune diseases. The same can be true of our horses. We've got a webpage on our website called Ew, What's in My Horse's Poo? And it is the most visited page on our website because, as you say, sometimes when you're doing your poo picking, you do come across these delights and wonders, don't you? And you think, what is that? We've only got 5 licensed chemicals to treat worms in horses, and there is now documented resistance to every single one of those. My dad would be walking around the collecting ring and picking up other horses' poo. Really embarrassing when you're a teenager, right? And we'd bring it home and he'd test it, and he was finding worm egg counts in the thousands there from just random horses that he'd sampled on a collecting ring field.
And Claire, we're seeing the use of sheep as field companions, obviously not to replace our horses' companions because it's so important they have other equines, but we've seen the use of sheep in paddocks now. Is it true or is it a myth that sheep help with horses' worm burdens?
Do we need to get better at talking about poo, do you think? With an ever-growing resistance to parasites, our horses need us to understand worms and how to tackle them. Claire Shand is the marketing director and part of the family business at Westgate Labs. Now that's a name we've all heard, haven't we, mentioned when it comes to postal worm counts. But what does that actually mean? How often should we be testing and worming? Let's get the facts, shall we, and bust those myths during this episode.
Claire, welcome to Curious Equestrian.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. It's great to be here.
Well, you must spend your life talking about horse poo.
Yeah, pretty much. Somebody has to. But I think if you can get over the ooh factor, actually, it's like parasites are really fascinating. You know, we don't like to think of them and the damage they do to our horses, but the whole evolution of how they even got to be here and work alongside of our horses and the survival strategies they have, they're actually pretty incredible things. So yeah, if you can put that behind you and we can delve in to actually look at what they do and how they operate and then how we can protect our horses, yeah, I think they're really fascinating.
Well, Claire, open our minds because I don't know how they came to be and how they came to interact with our horses. So take us back to that moment that they did start infiltrating our horses' lives.
Yeah, well, it's an evolutionary thing. So, I mean, millions of years ago, we had parasites that live in and on horses and they evolved that way. And they are generally species specific. And I guess the way that they interact now, the challenges that we get are because they evolved all this time ago when horses roamed really large areas. They were generally like not back over the same ground for a long time. There was lots of other multi-species there as well. So if we think about like a horse and a herd out in the wild, there could be like a woolly mammoth or a wild goat or anything that's going to come along and eat that grass like after the horses have been over it. And because the parasites are species specific, then if you're a tiny little worm larvae and you get eaten in the wrong host, you're toast, you're dead. So they evolved to put out millions of eggs every day. Like an adult female can lay that many eggs, which means that then now that we keep horses in single species generally in much smaller areas on these fields and they go back and back over the same grazing, that's what's really playing into the hands of the parasites. So yeah, and why we have this problem that we've got now, which is that they really are an issue.
And talk us through how much of a problem are they at the moment to the equestrian industry and to our pet horses?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue. And because of this real thing called wormer resistance, so we were getting these parasite problems in horses until about the 1960s. And then the pharmaceutical companies came up with these worming drugs, these chemicals, which killed the worms. And it really then helped the horses and to be free of the problems of parasite infection. And it was so effective that we were told worm every 8 to 12 weeks with these chemicals, and then you'll be absolutely fine. And so we had a few magic years where parasites faded into the background of being a problem, all was golden, and like life carried on sweetly. And then we realised sort of in the back end of the sort of 90s, particularly probably a little bit earlier in the real kind of scientific side of things, that there was this thing brewing called resistance. So just like antibiotics, we've got this problem where the worms develop and they develop resistances to the medications that we have. And slowly over time, these develop so that then the worms are no longer impacted by the drugs as well as they are. And then the drugs become less and less useful. And that's really, we're getting to a crisis point now with the medications that we've got available. So we've only got 5 licensed chemicals to treat worms in horses. And there is now documented resistance to every single one of those. And as time goes on, and as we expose the worms time again, that is just going to get worse. So we really, really need to sit up and take notice and change our ways. So we're getting to a point, and we've seen this in other species, like with sheep, where you can no longer keep animals on particular land where they've used a lot of wormers because all the parasites that are there have got this drug resistance. And we're creeping along that way with our horses. So it's really worrying times. So I hate to be like, start off on a downer and bring a bearer of bad news, but this is where we're at. So what we're really challenging people to do is to step in, use fewer wormers, and to use the science instead that's on our side so that we can only give the wormers where we need, keep them effective for as long as possible, which then is hopefully going to allow other things to come in to give us the opportunity to treat worms effectively and keep our horses safe. Because, I mean, the real thing is that we've got all these advances in veterinary medicine, and yet it could be these little ankle biters, these little parasites that could actually be the undoing of our ability to keep horses, to keep them safe, to keep them healthy. And that in turn has a real big industry-wide effect on businesses, on livery yards, on studs, like anywhere where we keep horses. If we can't keep them there anymore, or we can't keep them at the stocking densities, then they just become economically not viable. And like, that's a real big worry, right?
Well, I was going to say, Claire, please do be the bringer of bad news if it means that we can all learn from you and from what you've got to tell us. Because I think also there's so many myths and so many traditions that already exist at our livery yards and our stud farms and our riding schools. Everyone has their own way of doing things based on what they've been taught either as a child or through their equestrian lives. It does get very confusing. I've been to lots of different yards and everyone does their own thing, but often it's a very strict practice. You know, everyone must worm now, whether you want to go about and do your worm test and your fecal web counts, but actually they already have a practice in place that everyone has to adhere to. So Claire, can you walk us through what we should be doing with our horses right now in this problem that we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, I can totally identify with the situation. Things have changed an awful lot. You know, Westgate was 25 years old this year. So that's that long that we've been putting out this message and supporting people to use test-based parasite control. But there's been, as you say, lots of different ways of doing things. You know, we had our regular chemical programs, and then the drugs changed, and this, that, and the other. But actually, what's best practice now is really getting our testing first, and then only giving the wormers when we actually need to, you know, when the situation shows that. And we're not also trying to eradicate worms, because like we know that that's impossible. So instead we're looking at, well, what can we test? Where is the level at which a horse and a worm can live happily together, like a worm burden, without causing problems? Because we're getting science now from human medicine that shows that a small worm burden can actually be beneficial to horses. So just like in humans, when we eradicate all bacteria, pathogens, viruses, and everything else, we get autoimmune diseases. The same can be true of our horses, because that evolution and the immune system has developed alongside of that. And, you know, we've already talked about the history and the millennia. And there is a thinking that actually worms, because they want to thrive and survive in the horses, have this secretion that actually is a gut soother. So in small amounts, they are not a bad thing. However, we know we get to a point with parasite infection where they can cause all sorts of diseases, from just weight loss, anemia, those sorts of things, with blood loss, colics. I mean, something that's going to strike fear into a lot of horse owners. And that can be from impaction, from cutting off blood supply to the large intestines. There's a migratory phase that goes to the lungs, which can cause respiratory damage with ascarids and those parasites. And then ultimately there's death. An overwhelm can lead to that in horses. And it's incredibly sad that we can get to that situation. And once that was a proviso of ignorance and neglect, and now more and more that's being seen due to these resistance issues that we're facing. So we're giving the wormers, but we're just not double checking that they're working effectively. And therefore you're putting all these expensive chemicals in, and yet the outcome is that they're not effective, and that we still get these parasite burden buildups, and then that impacts the horse from a pathogenic point of view. So yeah, it's really, really important that we are looking at evidence-based control, which is really now what we are purporting that people do as their first port of call. So instead of reaching for the wormer, we're going to do, a wormer count would be the cornerstone of that. And then we've also got the Equicell tapeworm test. And they're the two tests really that we want to be doing through the year, particularly the worm egg counts regularly. And that's based on the life cycle of the particular parasites that we're looking at with that. And then we're only then stepping in with a wormer to treat those particular horses that are over a certain number of eggs per gram on their test results. And that's the way that we're going to start to keep them healthy. So having an overview of what's going on in the horses, but not using that regular chemical exposure, which is what's speeding this resistance problem.
And do you think actually part of the problem is the fact that livery yards, riding schools, and equestrians in general sort of clubbing together and having their worming regime together instead of actually clubbing together to do the poo counts? It almost becomes sort of like we all follow our traditional calendar we've always done throughout our lives with our horses, instead of investigating further into our horses' poo.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to normalise packing up our horse's poo and sending it off to that, And I think if you'd ever done that before, there's a perception that it's really difficult. And a lot of the livery yard and the yard managers that we speak to, they don't want to cause their liveries a problem. They don't want added expense or inconvenience. And so change is really hard, right? And until you've gone through the process and discovered that actually it's much easier than you might have expected it to be, and the results give you that much more information, I think it is difficult. Livery yard owners have got a lot on their plates and they're juggling all these other things. And one of the troubles with parasite infection is that it's largely unseen. Until you've got a problem, you can't just go out and look in your paddocks and think, I've got, you can't see the infection that's there waiting all around us in the environment. You can't look at a horse and say, that particular one is wormy necessarily. We've got horses here, my own Highland in particular, he's very wormy. Some of them are just more susceptible. He's one of those. And yet he's a great chunking, shiny conker looking thing. And you wouldn't necessarily look at him and think he would be predisposed. So it's not something that's kind of shouting in your face until you've got a particular problem. And then something like larval cyatostominosis, that's a small redworm larval burden, which is a mass emergence. It causes this, you've got an active worm infection, you've got then this colic that ensues from it. Really, really difficult to treat. And like with this bloody diarrhea and this colic, and we lose more than half of horses who have that particular worm problem. And it's not something that is apparent until it's an acute issue and it's happening right in front of you. So it's not a priority, and I can understand the reasons why yard owners and people are reluctant to go there. But what we do here on a positive note is that when they do, actually many times the livery clients are really happy. That's what they are wanting to move towards. It's much easier than they think. And it also gives them really useful information. So it works on multi-levels. And then if you're putting less chemicals on your land, it's really the people who manage these equestrian properties who stand to lose the most, because the resistance develops on the land itself. And if you're running a business, you think about our equestrian properties and that investment that goes into the arenas and the stable blocks and everything else that's on that site. Very difficult to then pick that up and move it to somewhere else. And a lot of them tend to be where they pass through family generations and where people tend to live and work at the same time as well. So there's a lot invested in there, and it is the resistance that develops on the land. So if we can change our ways, and there is still time to get into this targeted parasite control instead of these regular worming, then it's really going to help to buy us time and head off what is a potential catastrophe for the industry. Wormer resistance is now seen by the veterinary industry as one of the biggest threats to horse health. So above anything else, that's massive, that it's such a big red flag.
Gosh, I didn't realise it was such a huge problem at the moment. I knew it's something we had to be aware of. But Claire, if what happens if this continues to escalate? What are we looking towards in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really grisly problem, that none of us really want to answer. So it basically will put us back to before the 1960s, to before we had effective worming chemicals. It will mean that we are looking at managing parasite burdens by, purely the mechanical means. So if you we're looking at then breaking life cycles by poo picking is really the biggest one that we can do to minimize our use of chemicals, because the worm eggs that are passed from the adults so the adults live in the intestinal tract of the horse, and they are laying those tens of thousands of eggs every day, and they are passed then out into the dung, and then the dung is sitting in the paddock. After just a few days, those eggs will start to hatch into tiny larvae. And if you're a tiny larval worm, your sole goal in life is to wriggle away from the horse as far as possible from the dung pile, because horses don't like to graze near their dung. And you're going to climb a blade of grass, and you're waiting then for a horse to come back across that grass and to munch you up and to get you back inside of a horse and carry on your life cycle. So that's the basic life cycle of what we're looking at. And I've got an amazing photo which shows this dewdrop and all, which is clustered with tiny immature larval worms, but in this one single dewdrop hanging on this blade of grass. And then if you look to multiply that across the field, you can see the parasite challenge that's really there for us. So if we can then take that dung off the field before those eggs hatch, so that's like getting our poo picking done at least kind of twice a week if we can, that's going to go a massive way to removing those eggs. They're not going to hatch, and there's going to be a much lower challenge on the pasture, and our horses aren't going to be ingesting all those larvae to carry on and grow into adult worms within the horse. So that's a really, really good way. And then the other thing we can do is rest our paddocks. So we can do things like you can imagine those larvae that are hanging out there on that grass, but if there are no horses to eat them, they're going to die waiting. And that's what we really want. So that we want that to happen, which if we can rest our paddocks for 6-9 months a year, in between having horses on, but even 3 months, is going to go a really good way to break the life cycle of those redworm, particularly. Redworm is, there are several parasites that horses get, but 95% are going to be the redworm, the strong gals that horses get. And they are, because of their numerosity, they are the most dangerous. So those in particular are quite susceptible in the environment, and they're going to die off if we can leave them for that length of time, and that's going to help to lower the parasite challenge on the environment as well. So there's lots that we can be looking at, but without effective medications, we're on a sticky wicket really, because there aren't any new ones in development. The ones that we've had most recently, moxidectin, which came out in the late 90s, that was a derivative that came from agriculture. Because of food producing animals and because of the money that surrounds that, they are still looking at new wormers for farm animals. But the latest ones that have been developed for sheep are actually toxic to horses. So they're no good for us. And it costs so much to get them licensed that it really is a difficulty. I know that there are various things that scientists are looking at. So there are things like tannins, that kind of the thing that gives that kind of nice thing to wine, but also like you can get it into things like forage, like sandfoin is an ancient forage that has been used for many years for helping to reduce worm burdens, for example, in cattle, and you can get that for horses. They were looking at things like fungi. So if you put those into the gut, there are certain fungi that have an impact on worm burdens, and but it's like, how do you package them and make them palatable and get the dosage and that sort of thing? They're also looking at things like using AI for bacteriophage, which I don't know if it's a thing you've heard of, but it's a way of like adaptation for cells, which could make the worms more susceptible again to the wormers that we've got. So like making changes using bacteria and engineering that. So very, very complex science, but it could be something that is a win. But these things are a way off yet, and it is things that people are looking at. And it is such a worry that there is a new organisation called CANTER, which we're part of. So I sit on the core steering group for this, and I also lead the comms subgroup of this. And it's a specific pan-industry organisation which has been developed in order to combat this resistance problem. So it stands for Controlling Antiparasitic Resistance in Equines Responsibly, which is a massive mouthful, right? But it essentially is to communicate this urgency that we've got of the parasite risk to horses and the resistance issues to the chemicals. And it's been formed to look at, well, what strategies can we give to horse owners? What research do we need to do in order to help this? And then basically, how do we get best practice and people using this out in the field just to make this impact? Because we have to sit up and take notice, because as you said, I don't think anyone really realizes the severity of this particular issue and what we do about it.
Gosh, Claire, I've got so many questions for you, but so interesting that you mentioned that the resistance is in the land and not actually in the gut of the horse, because I always thought that resistance came if you overwormed your particular horse, but actually not thinking about the land that you might move your animals onto, where there may already be resistant bugs. Is that right? So you can actually inherit a problem when you move your animals?
Oh, yeah, 100%. So we've got to start looking at parasites as infectious disease. So just like any other, the worms can travel with the horses that they go with. So there is particular research that was done with an Irish yearling that travelled across to Kentucky and then had infected resistant worms and managed to infect the yearlings that it went into the field with in Kentucky. So it spread that problem. Basically, it took those resistant worms in its gut, laying those eggs out onto the pasture once it arrived in America. And the horses that it was out with, then that became, the parasite challenge, that they were ingesting those worms too. And therefore, that's how the resistant worms spread across to those horses and that farm as well. So yeah, it is a real big issue because of that. And I think just starting to understand a bit more of the life cycle of the fact that they need to get out onto the pasture. Those larvae are then, they're active in the environment before they're getting back inside of the horse. Then you start to realize how interconnected everything is. And the fact that then the more we move our horses around within herds and the more they go out for training and competition. I mean, certain centres that have a lot of horses through can be absolute hotbeds for that. And we know that because, 25 years ago when my dad set up Westgate, or before then even, I was a teenager, and we used to take our horses out competing to fairly high quality county shows. We would had tested our horses ourselves at home. My dad's a scientist, and he decided this would be an interesting thing to do. And why did we just give the chemicals without knowing if we needed them? Which I think if you come from a science background, it's a really valid question to ask. And if you're maybe, we just give the wormer, you wouldn't even think twice to note that. So anyway, we were testing our own horses and we were doing that. We weren't really seeing very many worms. And you start to think, well, my dad anyway started to think, is there a problem in the wider horse population? So my sister and I would go to shows, and my dad would be walking around the collecting ring and picking up other horses' poo. Really embarrassing when you're a teenager, right? And we'd bring it home and he'd test it, and he was finding worm egg counts in the thousands there from just random horses that he'd sampled on a collecting ring field. And then so you wish then you could know which those horses were so that you could give them advice and to help them. And that's really how Westgate began. We realised, yes, there was a parasite problem in the wider horse population, that and how could we help us to do worming better in the UK horse population, and how can we minimize the wormers and address this resistance problem at the same time? Because there are certain horses that aren't treated enough, and there are certain horses that are treated too much. Because if you're out there in a field and you've got your happy horses grazing away, they're all kept the same, they're managed the same, and they're there as a herd. And yet if you sampled them, you would generally find this distribution curve of 80-20. So 80% of the worms are in 20% of the horses. So generally, then you would find that only 20%-ish of a herd would need a treatment, and you can leave the rest untreated and fine, which then it goes a very long way to reducing your wormer use and therefore your exposure to chemicals, and then this resistance build-up of it. So really, really interesting.
And what do we do, Claire? I mean, there are a number of issues that the equestrian world are facing. One of them is the lack of land now. It's so hard as a horse owner to find land to rent, whether it's sole use or to find a space at a livery yard. If a field cannot be rested because of the lack of the land in the area, what can a horse owner or a livery yard owner do in that situation?
Yeah, you're right. It is a real issue. It's poo picking. Absolutely number one thing that you can do is to get out there and remove those droppings and stop those eggs from hatching on that pasture. It's going to be the best thing. Absolutely.
And I'm slightly actually quite worried about asking this question because it's actually an issue that I face. So we've kept our horses on a number of different sort of plots of land across different counties over the last 10 years. And the particular location we're at now, the muck heap is in the field. And I'm dreading your reaction to this because we've got no choice. The yard owner will only let us keep the muck heap in the field with the horses. Is that a complete no-no, error, disaster?
Well, it it kind of undoes all your good work, really, because we've already learned that these eggs hatch these tiny larvae, and these larvae are motile on the pasture. So basically, they're wriggling away and they're escaping. And there is some research that shows that in dry conditions, a tiny little larvae, like barely visible to the naked eye, can get about 1 meter from a pile of dung, but in wet conditions, 3 meters. So you really need to be looking at, can you fence your muck heap? And that will help to mitigate that, really. And so it's not the best. We've also got things like tapeworm, for example. Those have got what we call an intermediate host. So this is where evolution gets even more bonkers, is that, so we've got the horse as the main host species, but the eggs get passed out in the dung. They then get eaten by a tiny orobatid grassland mite. So really, really, that's what's running around on the grass. And that's what the horses are then ingesting in order for the tapeworm. I mean, I don't even know how these things...
Oh my gosh.
But it's fascinating and really clever. But then they're obviously even more mobile than the normal larvae, on their own. I was going to say 2 feet, but so they've got just extra ability, really, to get about, if you like.
So if listeners are in my situation, and because I've seen it at other livery yards as well, where the muck heap's in the field, or in the corner of a field, I should say, the best thing is to fence it off with about 3 meters squared, is it?
Yeah, I would do, definitely.
Will that solve the issue, Claire, or should it be 5 meters?
Well, it's about practicalities, isn't it? Really, you've got to do what you can do, and it sounds like you don't want to be shortening your grazing and having that impact. So it's always about what can you do to juggle all the things that are going on to find the best solution.
It's such a scary thing. So as you mentioned, it's something that we can't usually see. I mean, something that's been programmed in a lot of friends that I know that have got horses is looking for the ribby horse that's got a swollen belly. That's something I always hear amongst equestrian contacts. Oh, that's a wormy horse. It's showing ribs. It's got a swollen stomach. But actually, in a lot of cases, horses with high worm burdens, you can't see anything wrong. I mean, is there anything we should be trying to spot, Claire, from the field gate and from the stable?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You can certainly see horses that look as though they might be like wormy, but really it's about what can you do from a science perspective to measure that. And the one key thing really is doing your testing and doing it regularly. So like a single worm egg count is a snapshot of what's going on within the horse. It's a fairly rudimentary test, but it is the best we have in terms of, because they're easy to do, they're not expensive. And when we do them regularly, that's what really helps to give us a picture of like what's going on inside of our horses. So, and I think parasites, yes, that they're something that all horses need to be careful of. All horses get parasites in the environment. The first thing really that we can do is to look at the risk profile of particular horses. And it's the one, the output from CANTER that I've been involved in over the sort of last 12 months is to build this risk profile tool that horse owners can use to assess kind of how worried should we be. And I don't want to put the fear of God into everybody, because it's more about where are we at? Like, what is the risk profile of our horses? Is it low, medium, high? And therefore, what do we need to do in order to mitigate that and in order to keep the horses healthy, basically? So that goes on the CANTER acronym. So you can use C, so clinical data. So any horse that's got any underlying illnesses, for example, like something systemic like PPID or EMS or anything that's going on within the horse, or something that's a wormer resistance issue already, is already then higher risk of other things, because it makes them less resilient to parasite infection. Just like if our immune system's already working hard, you challenge it with parasite, it's just less able to respond. It's just how that is. Then we've got CANTERs at age of horses. We know that anything under 4 years old, younger horses, they are just so susceptible to parasites. And again, it's because their immune systems are underdeveloped. They haven't yet got that resistance. So particularly worms like ascarid, very, very common in young horses, but very much less common in older groups. And then just as in other animals and humans, as horses age, sometimes we can see their immunity drop as well, and therefore you might see a susceptibility growing to that. Then we've got N in our CANTER for number of horses. So the number of horses that we keep together, the more we have, the more important parasite control becomes. And again, the acreage piece on that as well. So if there are more horses on a smaller area of land, they're going to become higher risk of parasite infection. Then we've got our T for test results. So again, testing the horses gives you so much valuable information. You can start to spot the 80-20 of just the ones that are going to be more susceptible, because their test results demonstrate that they're coming back regularly. Even more so, I mean, you can think of a worm egg count as like a barometer for health. So we're taking several over a season, and in a horse that's always had like low or less than 50 eggs per gram count, if it suddenly starts to rise, you can begin to think, well, what else is going on for the horse at that particular time? Is it that there is some underlying issue developing, like a PPID or an EMS or something like that? Is it an aging thing? Has the horse moved and it been stressful, for example? And all those things can cause a fluctuation in those test results. So it's a fantastic indicator. And then we've got E, which is environment, and horses that are then poo-picked in well-managed land, much, much lower risk than horses that aren't, or where it's harrowed, for example. Harrowing in this country is just really not an effective way to manage parasites, because it spreads the worm eggs from what we call the latrine areas, like right into the lawns where horses graze. So it's doing their job for them and getting them closer. We just don't have, it's just too damp. in hot, arid countries where that could break open a dung pile and expose it to UV light and desiccate the larvae, yes, you could think of that as potentially an option, but not in good old Blighty, unfortunately. Even the hot days, we have wet, dewy kind of starts and that sort of thing. And where are we? So that's E, and then R really, then that gives us that risk factor. So there's a table that you can download if you go to the CANTER website, and then you can start to look at that overall risk profile of the particular horses. And that's then going to give you information of, well, where do you start? Because what we're really encouraging people to do is, rather than use an ad hoc basis, so like, I don't think I've done anything for parasites for a while, like get a strategic plan for the year. Work with an SQP, your vet, prescriber, to develop a plan with you that's going to look at the horses that are in that herd, the potential risk relative to them, and then you can put in a test-based plan. So the higher the risk of the horses, the what's the word? Running out of words here. The sooner we do our worm egg count tests, basically. So a healthy adult horse, you're looking about 12 weeks to do a worm egg count every 12 weeks.
Oh, wow.
If you had a younger or a higher risk, you would shorten that time to every 8. And that's really because the small redworm, which is the most virile and numerous of our horse parasites, just reproduces so fast. So we've, for example, tested a newborn foal, and then at 4 weeks old, it already had a positive worm egg count for redworm. So in that time, it had ingested the redworm, and then they'd become adults and egg laying within that horse, or the foal. So very, very fast life cycle, which means that a problem can really quickly get out of hand. And especially if you've then got this kind of lowered immunity that we get with youngsters and those that are higher risk, you just want to be up on top of that. You want to know what's going on, and you want to be able to get in there if you need to and choose the most appropriate drug for that. So yeah, that's why we test them so regularly in that particular situation. And then with tapeworm, so the worm egg count's predominantly looking for redworm and ascarid, 2 of the most common parasites that horses get. And then we've got the tapeworm, and the worm egg count isn't definitive for tapeworm because the eggs are secreted in little packets. So the roundworm, the redworm and ascarid, their eggs are pretty well distributed through the dung, which means that if you're taking 4 or 5 pinches from across a dropping to do your test, you're going to get a pretty representative sample from that of the worm eggs that are present. Whereas a tapeworm, you can think of those little flatworms with ridges in them, and it's those little ridgy kind of bits that are breaking off, and they're full of eggs. So they get released in packets, and then they burst in the dung, and then they distribute themselves. But because of that, they're not very evenly distributed. So we do see tapeworm eggs in the worm egg count samples, and we will report them, but it's not definitive. If we don't see them, we can't definitively say the horse doesn't have tapeworm. So for that, we would advise an Equisol saliva test, which is a really good, cost-effective way of doing that. But because tapeworm grows slower than our redworm, particularly, we would do that every 6 to 12 months, depending on the risk of the horse. So, and that pretty much is our regular testing that we want to be looking at for any horse herd, and the regularity of that depending on the risk factor. The only worm kind of subtype that we haven't really discussed, I guess, within that is the encysted stages of the small redworm. So I don't know if you've heard of those before.
I've heard about them, and I think I don't know enough about them.
Yeah, so the small redworm, there are about 40 different subspecies of small redworm, and they get ingested in the horse as normal, and then when they're tiny larvae, as part of their life cycle, they will then kind of embed themselves in the horse's gut wall as part of their life cycle, which then they will kind of grow up a little bit before they feel ready to come out into the gut and become egg-laying adults. So that's a normal part of quite a few of those species' life cycle. But in the winter time, when the worm activity, so below 6 degrees-ish, the worm activity really slows down on the pasture, And therefore, if you're a redworm, there's not much going on outside, you might as well snuggle in for a bit longer. So that's what they do basically. And they become what we call encysted in the gut wall. And they can stay there for, the thought is sometimes up to sort of 2-3 years. And you can get many millions of them just hanging out there, like in the gut wall, doing their thing, just waiting for an opportune moment to come out into the gut and carry on the life cycle and lay their eggs. And it's thought within our temperate climate, so that the best time for the encysted, or the most common time, is probably springtime. So whether that's increasing daylight hours or slightly warmer temperatures, something can trigger what we call a mass emergence. So oftentimes, if you get a lot of these that are encysted in the gut wall, they will all come out like at once within the horse's intestinal tract. And that, if you're a horse, is really damaging. You know, it's a big trauma to that gut to have all these tiny larvae suddenly coming out into the gut wall. And that's what triggers what we just talked about earlier, this larval cyatostominosis, it's called. So it's an active colic with this blood streak diarrhea because of all this damage, the trauma that it's caused to the gut wall. And it's really, really difficult to treat. You know, we lose a lot of horses every year to it. And so we want to guard against that. And that's why we specifically talk about our winter approach, particularly for these encysted redworms. So we're wanting to get in there after the activity on the pasture has started to cease, so that we get as many of those that are inhibited in the gut wall as we possibly can, before then we get into the potential spring and where we're more likely to get a mass emergence, which is why the encysted approach it used to be like in the sort of autumn, November time, and we've pushed that slightly later as our climate's changing and as our autumns have got warmer, essentially. So we're now looking at that as probably something to do in the winter, but certainly as the temperatures drop to below 6 degrees more regularly. And we need to make a decision. So there is a new test that's become available as of 2019, which is it's a small redworm blood test. And that does test for encysted stages of the small redworm as well as the gut laying ones. Because one of the limitations that we have with worm egg counts is that, well, in its very nature, it's an egg count. So it only is monitoring for the presence of these adults that are already mature and they're already in the gut wall. So if it's a larvae and it's embedded in the gut, it's not going to be laying any eggs, and the worm egg count, therefore, is not going to detect it. So we've got this brilliant new test, which is an ELISA. That means that it's working off antibodies that the horse is producing because it knows that they are there. And we can therefore monitor those proteins. And that can then give a level of probability that shows you whether you're going to need to step in and treat. Now, it's a very, very sensitive test, which means that then the people who manufacture that have advised that low risk horses, so if they've had worm egg counts that are less than 250 eggs per gram through the prior year, those are the horses that are in a low risk category that would be candidates in order to have this test, which means that then we're not stepping in and giving a specific treatment for encysted redworm possibility for those particular horses. Now, for others that aren't in that cohort, I would recommend that they do get a proactive treatment of a particular chemical that treats for the larval stages of those encysted redworm. And there aren't very many of those chemicals. So there are only two. There is moxidectin, which we'll know as our request products, and there's fenbendazole that we'll know as our Panacur 5-day. Now, there's a lot of resistance to the Panacur, so it would tend to be a moxidectin product that we would want to use to proactively treat for those. So, and they're really the decisions that we need to be making, and something that you're really going to want to discuss with your prescriber around your approach to that. There is a certain school of thought that says that if the horses look healthy and the worm egg counts have been okay over the last season, that you just do nothing. But I think because of the particular risk of the larval cyatostominosis, I'm not in the do nothing camp. You know, I'd be in you either want to be doing that blood test with your vet, or you want to be doing something proactive, because I don't believe it's those single treatments over the like once a year that's driving the resistance. It's this multiple use blanket worming that we really want to guard against. So yeah, it's quite complex, but
and as an owner, you do feel overwhelmed thinking, am I doing enough? Have I been doing too little? Do I need to now panic and run every test to see where we're at with our horses? If we have felt, not that we've been lax, but that we've followed a sort of traditional calendar pattern, and I know that I'm certainly, over the last couple of years, I've been guilty of that because we've moved our horses around a lot. So we've stuck to that sort of spring and autumn worming before we've moved them in quite a regime. If we're now at the point where we're coming up to where we'd be worming, should we jump in and do the tests first? Should we worm and then test? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I definitely do the testing. So if you've had your treatment in the winter for your potential of encysted, I'd be looking at relying on tests for the rest of that time. If you give a wormer, there's potential that worm is going to be working and active in the system, so it's going to mask whatever might be going on within the horse. So when you're due worming or slightly overdue is where you would want to step in and do those tests. And then that's going to give you the information. Well, essentially of, do you need to treat at all? And then if you do need to treat, what chemical are you going to choose? So because of resistance, we've got to be, there is no such thing now as a wormer that does everything, because certain worms have developed resistances, like more resistance to certain chemicals. So we absolutely want to be choosing the right one. We want to be preserving key medicines. So that's like, when I say that, it's really like, we know that a Quest, for example, is our best wormer that we have for the larval stages of those small redworm. But if we had a worm burden through the summer that was adult redworm, then an ivermectin wormer, for example, would be a much better treatment. It's very, very effective against those adults, and we're not then exposing the moxidectin, which is going to build resistance to that. So it's really like choosing the right chemical for the right horse, the right time of year, and the right parasite. And there's lots of different things that go into that.
And if we do get a great result on our fecal egg count, does it mean that as long as we keep testing, we can actually avoid using those chemicals and avoid worming our horses?
Exactly that. Yeah. So it means that we're only using the chemicals when we need to. And conversely, if it brings up a problem, you know what that is and you know to deal with it. So when you get a worm egg count result, that's going to give you an eggs per gram. So that's how your results come to you. We say between up to 200 is a low count. So no need to worm at that level. The horse can usually deal very well with that level of parasites. We're not going to do anything. So that's fantastic from a resistance point of view, and you're not going in and giving unnecessary chemicals. And then between 200 and 1200 is what we would term a medium count. So the horse needs worming, but it's nothing to be alarmed about. Horses do get parasites, and from time to time, we do need to step in and support them with chemical wormers. So that's fine. We're not worried. What we might want to do is to follow up. So we can do what we call a reduction test, which monitors, we've given a wormer 10 to 14 days after we've given that treatment. We do a second worm egg count, and that gives us really good information about how effective that chemical has been. Is there resistance? Has it been effective? And we can use that to then determine, is that done, or do we need to do something different? And then above 1200, the worm egg count is deemed high. We definitely want to give a treatment. We also probably want to look at the management of that horse and what we do to help prevent the potential worm burden being that high in the future. So, and people do get freaked out maybe by when their horses return high worm burdens, but actually, it's giving you good information, and then you can go on and deal with it. And we do get counts that are in the thousands, very, very high. Well, I think the highest we ever had was 84,000 for a worm egg count.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So actually don't feel any shame or embarrassment if your result does come back high.
Oh, well, absolutely. It's highlighting something that you can deal with. So you want to know, and I know I've been in a livery yard situation where the worm egg counts are done, the list goes up, And then there's the wormer of shame is left on your stable door if you need to treat. But like, actually, like, it's just a thing, you know? I'd said, you know, I've got a Highland pony. He is a wormy little thing. And it's just life, you know? You just got to deal with it, really. And at least you can. It's the knowledge that's the power in this situation, truly. Yeah. And again, well, particular infections like tapeworm, for example, we know that the tapewormers, we've got two, a double dose of pyrantel or a praziquantel, the two different chemicals that we've got for that. And there's now a question mark over the efficacy of both of those wormers. Unfortunately, that was raised in sort of autumn last year by a scientist called Martin Nielsen. And now that's a massive concern. But the thing with tapeworm infections, for example, is that those chemicals will only take out the adult worms, so they don't deal effectively with any larvae that are present. So, for example, sometimes you can get a tapeworm infection that shows up on an equine saliva test, and then you can treat, but then 4 months later when you test again, then the horse still has a tapeworm infection, and you might need, because the larvae have come through that were there waiting in the gut, or there's been reinfection, and so you might need a little bit of a concerted test and treat in order to get on with that. And it was something that was really highlighted to me back in 2015 when the test first came on the market. So I used it with my horse Teddy and my older boy, who's always very resilient to parasites generally. And he's had a Pramox in the winter, which is a Quest Pramox. So that's a moxidectin for his larval stages of Redworm, and also then the praziquantel in that for tapeworm, because at that time we couldn't really test for tapeworm very easily. And so he'd had that in the January time, and it was about the April, and I did a tapeworm test for him, and he actually came back with a score of 12, so positive for tapeworm and needing another treatment. And that would be because it hadn't had, he'd had a burden. The praziquantel in the Equest Pramox had taken out some of that, but there'd either been a resurgence or some larvae that were present, and I needed to go back in, treat again, and then when I tested him subsequently, that was dealt with. But it highlights all these issues and that you wouldn't know were there unless you did the testing. So that's why it is just so very useful.
And Claire, we're seeing the use of sheep as field companions, obviously not to replace our horses' companions because so important they have other equines, but we've seen the use of sheep in paddocks now. Is it true or is it a myth that sheep help with horses' worm burdens?
Oh, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's a really good point. Cross-grazing is a fantastic way of dealing with your parasite infection. And it will go both ways. The horses that eat the sheep feces with the sheep parasites and the sheep eat the horses' parasites. It really helps to break that life cycle. Really great way of managing.
Oh, that's great news, because sometimes we worry that when we hear myth busting that actually some of these positive myths are actually, oh no, that's not actually true, and it won't help our horses out.
Yeah, and if you don't want to graze them together, you can just run the sheep on after the horses have been on it. So again, that even multi-layering your cross-grazing like that way is a perfectly valid way of doing it.
Brilliant. Also, is it a myth, Claire, that we can see the parasites in the poo? That actually if we pick up the poo, we can see them crawling or squirming in there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think, we've got a webpage on our website called Ew, What's in My Horse's Poo? And it is the most visited page on our website because, as you say, sometimes when you're doing your poo picking, you do come across these delights and wonders, don't you? And you think, what is that? And so it is, it's not common, but it does happen that we see parasites passed out in the droppings. But conversely, you can have horses with high burdens that you worm, and then people say, "But nothing came out." And they're religiously checking to see what's there. So it doesn't really correlate, but absolutely you can see those parasites present in the dung, particularly when you've got high burdens. And I think it's especially when you've got anything that kind of loosens the droppings, like a spike of adrenaline. So a horse in new home or something exciting has happened. And then that can really help to, I think it speeds the exit through the gut and you're more likely to see them, because you've got to remember that the horse's gut is really long, and so sometimes they do get digested, or they're even if they are shed in the dung, it's kind of, you don't always see them come out the other end because they have gone through a digestive process and the horse may have reabsorbed them or started to digest them within it. But yeah, comparatively, yeah, you do see them too out in the dung. And you see other things too, like fly eggs and seeds and things like that, which also can masquerade as parasites and cause people like heartache that's not actually due. So
I often pick through and think, what's that bright yellow colour? And I think, oh yeah, they've started on their turmeric supplement. So that's obviously why, you have these panic moments of, what on earth have I spotted? And then you realise it's something dietary that you've actually implemented yourself.
Yeah, or sometimes fly eggs are like laid in after, so the dung is out on the pasture and then they come along and lie things in them, and then you're like, oh, it's okay. Because I suppose the good thing about horses is there are, I've just got a little moth. Hi. There are only a certain number of parasites, so they don't tend to get the exotics to worry about, if you see what I mean. It tends to be like a set level or number of things that they can get. And it might be worth just covering those off. So the most frequent that we're going to have is our redworm. We can be small redworm, most numerous. Large redworm in this country was largely eradicated with the frequent worming that we did through the 60s and 70s. I think doing more targeted parasite control, there is a sort of waiting and watching to see whether we get a resurgence, particularly because it's a problem in European countries, in New Zealand and other places. We've already talked about how those parasites, they cross borders, they come in and get imported with horses that carry those. So that is a potential concern that we just need to watch and wait on, I think, and see what happens with it. So there's our redworm. We've got our ascarid. So that's a common parasite of young horses in particular. They're the really large white kind of spaghetti type worms that very, very dangerous in young horses with small intestines, cause blockages and things like that, and also have that they can migrate to the respiratory tract. And we've got our tapeworm, which we also talked about. So they're the ones that are kind of the ones we need to test regularly for, and also can cause the most damage. The next level, if you like, the secondary worms that horses get, the pinworm. Don't know if you've heard of that one. It's not a true kind of intestinal parasite in that it lays its eggs around the horse's anus area, so like externally. So it's not regularly, we do see them on worm egg counts, but not regularly. And it's not really that dangerous. It just really is a pain in the bum. It makes the horses itch, it's irritating, and it can be a recurrent thing because the horses you think you've got rid of it, it's got about a 5-month life cycle, and then for whatever reason, they ingest the egg again from where they've rubbed on the stable wall or the gate post or whatever, and then you've got this problem. And they do tend to be shed in the dung because that's, the females go to the end of the rectum to lay their eggs, and then they tend to then be passed out in the dung, and that can look really unsightly when you're at shows. Nobody wants to be that horse mum, do they? So
I've heard they're incredibly hard to detect, Claire, as well, that actually they don't show up in fecal egg counts, and that you have to sort of put a bit of tape on your horse's arm. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah, so these tiny eggs that are like rugby ball shaped eggs that the pinworm produce are laid in this kind of sticky substance, and that's what we're trying to detect. So we do this sellotape test, which is like a sticky adhesive tape test, and you are literally putting that in and around where those eggs could be laid, and then we're sending that to the lab, and we're looking at it under the microscope and seeing whether we can find those eggs and therefore the presence of the pinworm. Because horses itch for loads of different reasons, right? Flies, sweet itch, all sorts of different skin ailments and things like that. And so if we've got pinworm, it can help to narrow that down, and then what you do in order to treat that. So it is a useful thing, and that would be the test to do if you thought you had that problem. Yeah,
Claire, thank you so much. It is overwhelming as a horse owner to think of all the different things we must do to test and to prevent, but you've really helped us break it down this episode. So thank you so much. Before you go, I've got to ask you, what has it been like watching your dad, who's a scientist, create Westgate Labs and actually see it come into fruition, become a success, and something that so many equestrians actually rely on to care for their horse.
Oh, yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful. I think he's really been a pioneer in the industry and provided something that was a real gap in the market. We really needed this. We really needed to get on top of it because change is really slow and difficult. So, yeah, I've been in the equestrian industry myself for all my career, but not with Westgate because it was just such a tiny gem of an idea. And that I've always kind of moonlighted for Westgate and been on their trade stands and designed their website and done their marketing and things. And so it was a real honour when it was 2015 when I left my career at the British Equestrian Federation, where I was head of Marcoms there, and came back to Westgate to help. And it's such an amazing thing to be part of, to be able to help horse owners, to be able to altruistically, we have this massive problem. We're all horse owners. We love them. We want to be able to keep them healthy, now and then into the future. And this is a really big problem and we need to be able to do something about it. So yeah, the fact that my dad has been such a pioneer to make these services accessible, to really champion best practice, and to be a port of call for horse owners. I understand that parasites can be confusing and overwhelming, but to have a trusted place that people can go to for that information, there is no stupid question, and we're really happy to help. It's much more than just a test. It's much more about your overall horse health. How do you keep them? How do you manage them? But within, we're all horse owners. It's got to be practical. It's got to be doable, and it's got to be straightforward and simple. So that's really what we exist for and why. And so yeah, it can be grisly at times, but we're making a difference, which is cool. So yeah, it's amazing.
And you're opening up our worlds as well to encourage us all to get up close and personal with something that we don't often talk about. We don't talk about poo, do we, in conversations and in, within our communities and our friends and our families. And we don't talk about our horses' poo enough. So encouraging us all to get up close and personal and to go rooting around in our horses' poo and start today by testing them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, obviously we do at our dinner table, but clearly not at your
Maybe we all need to be doing it at our dinner tables more often. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you for all of the wisdom that you've shared with this episode. It's been eye-opening.
You're really welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
And Claire, for those who are worried, who want some advice, who think, I need to test my horse today, how do they do that?
Yeah, please get in touch. Yeah, we've got our phone lines are open from 9 till 5, Monday to Friday in the lab. So you can phone us, you can email us on info@westgatelabs.co.uk. You can drop us a messenger, DM, or an Instagram, any of those ways, and we'd be really, really happy to help. Yeah, please get in touch. And if you want to discuss your individual horse, your herd, you want a plan, you've got a problem, there's not much we haven't seen or heard, and we would be really delighted to help you. So yeah, please get in touch.
Thank you so much for listening to and watching Curious Equestrian. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube so that you don't miss an episode and all that's coming your way, or you can subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you listen. If you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, that would really help us to find lots more lovely listeners. And you can also follow us on Instagram @Curious Equestrian Podcast. We'll see you next time.